The wrench slipped from Etta Sawyer's hand and clanged against the stone lip of the well with a sound that rang out across the dry New Mexico air like a gunshot. And Robert Whitfield, standing not 10 feet behind her with his arms crossed and his jaw set harder than the limestone beneath his boots, muttered something under his breath that she absolutely heard. She heard every word of it. She straightened her spine, kept her back to him, and reached down into the dark throat of the well shaft where the corroded iron coupling had been blocking the water flow for going on 3 weeks. 3 weeks without reliable water on a cattle ranch in the summer of 1883 was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for livestock, for the land, for everything Robert Whitfield had spent the last 9 years building out here in the high desert east of Santa Fe. Miss Sawyer. His voice was low and controlled, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. I appreciate you making the attempt, but perhaps it would be better if you stepped aside and let me send for the man from Cimarron. He is due to pass through on Friday, and he has done this kind of work before. Etta did not step aside. She had not come 900 miles from St. Louis on a rattling, dust-choked train and then another 40 miles on the back of a hired buckboard to be dismissed by a man who had been told, incorrectly, she was beginning to understand by her own cousin Miriam, that she had no practical skills whatsoever, that she was decorative, that she could embroider and play piano and discuss literature, and that was the whole compass of her usefulness. Miriam had meant it kindly. Miriam had believed it. That was the dark secret at the heart of this entire situation, the hidden truth that Etta had not yet had the chance to reveal. And the longer she stayed quiet about it, the more it was beginning to feel like a trap she had set for herself by failing to correct the record the moment she stepped off that buckboard 2 days ago. She wedged her fingers around the coupling, felt the precise point where the threading had stripped and backed up against itself, understood immediately what 3 weeks of guessing and hired hands yanking on it had done to compound the original problem, and felt the familiar cold clarity settle over her mind the way it always did when she faced something broken that the rest of the world had decided was beyond saving. Mr. Whitfield, she said without turning around, how long has it been making that grinding sound before it stopped producing water entirely? A pause. She heard his boot shift against the dry ground. About 10 days before it quit completely. So roughly a month total. She nodded to herself. Someone over-tightened the lower coupling trying to fix a minor leak. The threading gave out and the whole assembly rotated until it sealed against itself. It has been sitting here rusted in that position for 3 weeks while everyone has been trying to pull it straight out. She pulled a small steel pick from the leather roll she had laid open beside the wellhead. You cannot pull it out. You have to turn it, counterclockwise, about a quarter turn, and then it will drop free. Another silence, longer this time. How do you know that? He said. It was not quite a question. It had the shape of a man being forced to revise something he had been absolutely certain about, and finding the revision both necessary and deeply unwelcome. Because I watched my father repair every well on 4 different properties over the course of my childhood, Etta said. And then I repaired them myself for the next several years after he passed. My cousin Miriam told you I had no practical skills because Miriam has never seen me work. She knows me as the woman who visits on holidays and sits in the parlor. She fit the pick against the seam and applied careful, measured pressure. She does not know me as the woman I actually am. The coupling gave a low, reluctant groan. Then it turned. Then the whole mechanism dropped free into Etta's waiting palm, and from the dark depths of the well shaft came the sound that Robert Whitfield had not heard in 3 full weeks, the quiet, rushing, utterly vital sound of water moving freely. He did not say a word. She turned around, finally, and held up the corroded coupling so he could see it. The afternoon sun caught the rust on its threading, and it looked like something that had been holding on by pure stubbornness long past the point where holding on made any sense. Etta thought, not for the first time in the past 48 hours, that she recognized the feeling. Robert Whitfield was 34 years old, and he had a face that had been worked over by the New Mexico sun into something that was not handsome in the easy, unearned way some men managed, but was interesting in every way that mattered, the kind of face that had accumulated its character honestly, through weather and difficulty, and a quality of attention to the world around him that showed in the set of his eyes. Those eyes, which were the particular gray-green of sage after rain, were fixed on the coupling in her hand with an expression she could not quite interpret. He was not a man who wore his feelings simply. She had understood that within the first hour of meeting him. What she had not yet understood was whether the walls he kept around himself were there to protect something worth protecting, or whether they were simply the architecture of a man who had decided, at some point in the past, that letting anyone pass them was too high a risk. "The new coupling will need to be ordered from Santa Fe," she said, keeping her voice practical and matter-of-fact, because that was the ground she was most sure of right now. "In the meantime, the well is flowing, but the connection is loose. I can pack it with a hemp rope seal to hold for 2 or 3 weeks until the new hardware arrives. Do you have rope?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I have rope." He walked toward the barn, and Etta released a breath she had not entirely realized she had been holding. She had arrived at the Whitfield ranch 2 days ago, in response to a correspondence that her cousin Miriam had initiated on her behalf without Etta's full knowledge. Miriam, who lived in Kansas City, and who worried about Etta in the particular way that happily married women worry about unmarried women of 28 who show no signs of correcting the situation, had been corresponding with a woman named Mrs. Clara Dunmore in Santa Fe, who ran what she described as a respectable introduction service for frontier families seeking capable household partners. Etta had known about the correspondence in a general sense. She had not known that Miriam had submitted a description of her that was, at best, a selective portrait. Miriam had written, in good faith and with genuine love, that Etta was educated, refined, musically accomplished, well-read, and possessed of excellent social graces. All of this was true. What Miriam had not written, because Miriam genuinely did not know it, was that Etta had spent 5 years running the practical operations of her late father's St. Louis hardware import business after his death, that she could read engineering diagrams, that she had a working knowledge of machinery, irrigation systems, structural carpentry, and the repair of most things that broke in the ordinary course of a working life. Miriam saw Etta at Christmas and Easter. She saw the parlor version. She had described the parlor version to Mrs. Dunmore, and Mrs. Dunmore had passed the parlor version along to Robert Whitfield, and Robert Whitfield had agreed to the introduction on the basis of a woman who, as far as he had been told, was entirely ornamental. Which meant that when Etta had stepped off that buckboard 2 days ago with her father's old leather tool roll tucked into her travel bag, alongside her dresses and her books, Robert Whitfield had looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has ordered a draft horse and received instead something that appeared to be a thoroughbred and was not sure whether to be delighted or suspicious or both. He had been unfailingly polite. He had shown her the ranch house, introduced her to his ranch hand Domingo Reyes, shown her the bunkhouse where Domingo slept, explained the operations of the cattle operation, and told her in terms that were courteous but absolutely direct that the ranch required a capable partner, not a companion, and that if she found the realities of frontier life incompatible with her expectations, there was no shame in saying so and he would arrange her return passage. Etta had listened to all of this with the full attention she gave everything, and then she had asked to see the well. He had looked at her strangely. She had repeated the request. He had taken her to the well. She had looked at the wellhead for about 45 seconds, asked him 3 specific questions about the timeline and symptoms of the problem, and then she had gone back inside and eaten the dinner he had prepared. He cooked himself, as it turned out, competently and without apology, and slept on the problem overnight. The next morning she had unpacked her father's tool roll and gotten to work. It was now the afternoon of that second day, and the well was running. She sat back on her heels beside the wellhead and listened to the water moving below, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the particular satisfaction of a solved problem. Then she picked up her tool roll and began replacing the instruments in their proper pockets, which was when she heard Robert's boots on the hard dirt behind her and turned to find him standing there with a length of hemp rope and an expression that she could not read at all. He held out the rope. She took it. Their fingers did not touch. They were both very careful about that, and the carefulness itself was a kind of information, Etta thought. People were not careful about touching unless they were thinking about it. She cut a length of rope with her pocket knife, another item that had caused him to blink when she produced it, and began working the fibers into the joint of the loosened coupling, packing them tightly in a spiral pattern that would swell when it contacted water and create a seal that would hold under reasonable pressure for several weeks. She worked steadily and without haste, aware of him watching her from a respectful distance, aware also that the watching was different now than it had been an hour ago. An hour ago he had been watching her the way a man watches someone he expects to fail. Now he was watching her the way a man watches something he is trying to understand. There was a world of difference between the two, and Etta was experienced enough in being underestimated to know exactly which one felt better. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said, when she was nearly finished. "My father was Jonathan Sawyer." She kept her hands moving. "He ran Sawyer Hardware Import and Repair in St. Louis for 23 years. When I was small, he used to take me with him on service calls because my mother did not like me underfoot during her piano lessons. I sat in corners and watched him work on things. Eventually sitting and watching became helping, and helping became doing." She packed the last fiber into place. "When he died in 1878, I was 23. My brother Daniel was supposed to take over the business, but Daniel had gone to law school in Boston and had no intention of coming back to St. Louis. I ran the business for 4 years with our foreman, Mr. Ake, until we sold it in 1882. She stood up and tested the connection with her hand. It held. "Your cousin's letter," Robert said slowly, "described you as accomplished in music, literature, and social graces." "Yes." Etta wiped her hands on the cloth she kept in the tool roll for exactly this purpose. "Miriam knows me very well in some ways and not at all in others. I should have written to Mrs. Dunmore directly to correct the description. I did not, and that was my mistake." She met his eyes. "I apologize for the confusion. I should tell you that I am also those things, the music and the literature and so forth, but they are not the whole of what I am." Robert Whitfield looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light was slanting across the desert floor and catching the silver-gray dust that hung perpetually in the air out here, and it turned everything warm and slightly golden, and in that light his face had a quality that Etta was careful not to look at too directly, the way you were careful not to look too directly at something bright. "You are nothing like what I was expecting," he said finally. "No," Etta agreed. "I imagine I am not." She gathered her tool roll and walked back toward the ranch house, and she did not look back, and she did not allow herself to think too carefully about the fact that somewhere between the grinding protest of the coupling and the first sound of free-running water, something had shifted between them, something small and tentative, and she suspected, absolutely irreversible. The well was fixed. That was the practical fact of the matter. Everything else was still, as of that moment, an open question. That night, Robert made dinner again, roasted chicken and dried corn, and a gravy that was plainer than anything Etta had grown up eating, but was honest and warm and somehow exactly right for the altitude, and the silence of the desert night pressing against the windows. They ate at the kitchen table across from each other, and the conversation was careful at first, navigating the particular geography of two strangers who were not quite strangers anymore, who had been placed in each other's proximity by an arrangement that was half business proposal and half something neither of them had fully named yet. Etta had known, going into this, what the arrangement was. Mrs. Dunmore's service was not a mail-order bride catalog in the crude sense that phrase sometimes implied. It was an introduction service for what Mrs. Dunmore called practical partnerships matches between men who needed capable partners for the real work of frontier life and women who wanted a life that was larger and more demanding than what the eastern cities offered them. The understanding was that both parties would spend a period of time, typically 2 to 4 weeks, in each other's company before making any decision about whether to proceed further. Robert had explained this again at dinner that first night, with the precise care of a man making sure there were no misunderstandings about what was being offered and what was being asked. Etta had appreciated it. The clarity was respectful. It acknowledged that she had agency in the decision, which not every man in 1883 New Mexico would have thought to acknowledge. Now, on the second night, the conversation had moved past the formalities. He asked about her father, and she found herself talking about Jonathan Sawyer in a way she rarely did with people she had just met. The way he had moved through the world with his hands always slightly calloused, always reaching toward whatever was broken, his absolute conviction that anything could be fixed if you understood it well enough. She told Robert about the hardware store's back room where she had spent entire afternoons as a girl, surrounded by iron and brass and the smell of machine oil, learning the names of every fitting and fastener in her father's inventory. Robert listened without interrupting. This was, she was already learning, one of his essential qualities. He was a man who listened completely, who gave the person speaking the full weight of his attention, who did not use the time you were talking to compose what he was going to say next. "He sounds like someone who believed in the value of things that worked," Robert said when she had finished. He believed that understanding how something worked was the most honest form of respect you could show it, Etta said. He used to say that people who owned things without understanding them were just keeping them prisoner. Something shifted in Robert's expression, subtle but real, and he looked down at his plate for a moment before he said, "My father believed the opposite. He believed that knowing how something worked was beneath a man of property. That was what you hired people for." There was a history in that sentence that Etta did not press on. Not yet, but she filed it carefully. "Is that what brought you out here?" she asked instead, getting far enough from that way of thinking. He looked up at her, and there was something sharp and assessing in his gaze, the look of a man who is not accustomed to being read accurately on a short acquaintance. "Among other things," he said. She did not push further. She refilled his coffee cup from the pot on the stove, and he thanked her. And outside the coyotes began their evening conversation somewhere in the arroyos to the north. And the lamp on the table made the room feel smaller and warmer and more like a place where people lived their real lives. And Etta thought that this place, this hard, beautiful, difficult, honest place, was beginning to feel less like a destination and more like something she recognized. The following days developed their own rhythm, the way life in close proximity always does. Etta woke early, because the desert turned warm fast and the morning was the best working time, and she found that Robert was always already up, already outside, already moving through the first tasks of the day with the self-contained efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. They worked around each other at first with the careful courtesy of people who were still mapping each other's boundaries, learning where the edges were. On the third morning, Domingo Reyes arrived from the southern pasture to report that 3 sections of the fence line along the eastern property boundary had collapsed overnight, likely a combination of age and a brief windstorm that had come through before dawn. Robert's jaw tightened and he reached for his hat, and Domingo was already explaining the extent of the damage and calculating the lumber they would need when Etta, who had been listening from the doorway of the ranch house, said, "Do you have the old fence posts from the last repair stored in the barn?" Both men looked at her. "There were about 12 posts stacked along the south wall," she said. "I noticed them yesterday." "They are weathered," Domingo said carefully. He was a man of about 45, compact and deeply serious, with a face that had seen enough of life to be cautious about new information before trusting it. He had been watching Etta since her arrival with the particular wariness of a man whose professional life could be disrupted by a change in household dynamics. They would not last. Not as vertical posts, no, Etta agreed. But if you split them lengthwise and use them as horizontal rails, with new vertical posts only at the anchor points, you would use about a third of the new lumber and the fence would hold just as well. The rails take less stress than the posts. She paused. If you want to do it that way. She was careful about the last sentence. She was in this man's professional territory and she knew it, and she had no intention of riding roughshod over Domingo's expertise to prove a point. Domingo looked at her for a moment, then looked at the fence posts in his mind, then looked at Robert. Robert was already looking at Etta. It would save a day and a half of work, Domingo said slowly, and about $40 in lumber. Then let us try it, Robert said. They rode out to the fence line together, all three of them. Etta on the older of Robert's two spare horses, a gray mare named Della who had a smooth gait and an opinionated personality that Etta liked immediately. The eastern property line ran along the edge of a wide arroyo, and the collapsed sections had buckled where the ground had shifted slightly in the wet season, a recurring problem that no permanent solution had ever adequately addressed. While Robert and Domingo began pulling the collapsed sections free, Etta walked the full length of the damaged area and looked at where the soil was soft and where it was firm, traced the patterns of water drainage with her eye, and then walked back to where Robert was working and said, "If you dig the anchor post holes 6 inches deeper on this end and pack the base with gravel before setting the posts, the drainage will be better and you will not have this collapse again. The ground here is clay heavy. It holds water and shifts." Robert straightened up from where he had been crouching and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was reassessing something he had previously categorized and was finding the new category insufficient. "You know soil types," he said. "I know drainage," she said. "My father had a contract with a construction company for 2 years. I managed the supply orders and spent enough time on sites to learn what makes a foundation fail." Domingo, who was within earshot, said nothing, but Etta saw him nod once, small and definitive, the nod of a man who has updated his assessment. They dug the anchor post holes deeper. They packed them with gravel from the dry wash at the bottom of the arroyo. They split the old fence posts as Etta had suggested and used them for rails. The work took 4 hours instead of the day and a half it would have taken otherwise, and when they rode back toward the ranch house in the late afternoon, the three of them in a loose line with the long desert shadows stretching out ahead of them, Robert rode up beside Etta and said, quietly, so that Domingo couldn't hear, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. The evening light was full in his face, and he was not avoiding her eyes the way people did when an apology was mostly performance. "For what specifically?" she asked. "For the first 2 days," he said. "I was thinking of you as someone to be managed, to be accommodated. I was already planning how I would tell Mrs. Dunmore that the arrangement was not going to work because I could not afford to keep a ranch running and also devote time to," he paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully, "to maintaining a companion." "A companion," Etta repeated. "That was the word in my head," he said. "I am not proud of it." "No," she said. "I imagine you are not." A beat of silence, with the horses moving steadily beneath them and the desert doing its evening thing of becoming briefly, unbearably beautiful. "You are not a companion," he said. "That is evident. I am sorry it took me this long to see it clearly." "You were told something incorrect by someone who believed it," Etta said. "That is Miriam's error and mine, not yours. You made a reasonable judgment based on the information you had." "I made an assumption," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him again, at the lines of his face in the dying light, at the quality of directness he brought even to this, the willingness to call his own behavior by its right name without dressing it up in excuses. She felt something loosen in her chest, some careful guardedness that had been maintaining itself since the moment she stepped off the buckboard. "Yes," she said. "There is a difference. Thank you for knowing that." They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was, for the first time, entirely comfortable. The days that followed were the kind that built something, though Etta could not have named precisely what was being built or in what proportion it was practical, and in what proportion it was something else. She took stock of the ranch house with the same methodical eye she had brought to the well and the fence line, and what she found was a home that was structurally sound and functionally organized, but that had been built and maintained entirely around the needs of one person working alone, with no concession anywhere to the possibility of a second life sharing the space. It was not unwelcoming. It was simply singular, like a sentence written to be complete in itself, with no room for an additional clause. She did not try to change it all at once. She knew better than that. She fixed the hinge on the root cellar door that had been causing it to drag and stick, because a sticking door in a working kitchen was a constant small friction that wore on a person without their ever quite identifying the source. She reorganized the tool storage in the barn into a system that was logical and retrievable, labeling the shelves in a clear hand, and asked Robert's permission before she did it, and explained exactly what she intended, which he gave readily, and then came to inspect the finished result with the focused interest of a man who was learning to pay a different kind of attention. She found the ranch's account books one afternoon when Robert was out in the south pasture, and Domingo had gone into the nearest town, a small settlement called Arroyo Seco, for supplies. The books were kept in a locked box in the office room off the kitchen, and Robert had shown her where the key was kept on her first day, and told her she was welcome to look at whatever she needed to understand the operation of the ranch. She sat down with the books and read them carefully, and what she found was a ranch that was genuinely viable, more than viable, in fact, but that was losing money in two specific places that were fixable. The cattle were being sold through a broker in Santa Fe, who was charging a commission that was not unreasonable in itself. But there was a buyer in Cimarron who was known in the industry to pay consistently higher prices and deal directly, cutting out the broker's percentage entirely. And the feed cost for the winter months was being managed inefficiently, ordering in small quantities at high prices rather than purchasing in bulk at the beginning of the season. She wrote up her observations carefully in a letter format, with specific numbers to support each point, and left it on the desk for Robert to find. She was in the kitchen making biscuits. She had discovered that Robert's biscuits, while edible, had the texture of something that had given up on life, and had taken over that specific task with his slightly wounded but gracious consent, when she heard him come in from outside and stop in the office. There was a long silence. Then he appeared in the kitchen doorway with the letter in his hand, and an expression that was complicated in ways she found interesting to look at. "You went through the account books," he said. "You told me I was welcome to look at whatever I needed to understand the operation," she said, not stopping her work. "I believed you meant it." "I did mean it," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that told her he had not entirely anticipated what that meant in practice. "The broker in Santa Fe, how do you know about the Cimarron buyer?" "My father's business supplied hardware to ranching operations across 3 territories. I kept the correspondence files for 4 years. I know most of the major buyers and their reputations." She pressed the biscuit cutter into the dough. "Raymond Chastain in Cimarron has a reputation for honesty and a consistent premium price. He deals directly and pays promptly. The broker in Santa Fe is neither dishonest nor incompetent, but he is a middleman, and middlemen cost money." Robert sat down at the kitchen table, still holding the letter, and looked at it again. "The feed calculation," he said. "I would need to have the cash available at the beginning of season for the bulk purchase. That has been the difficulty. If you sell to Chastain instead of through the broker this fall, you will have it," Etta said. "The premium he pays over what you are currently receiving would cover the bulk purchase with enough left over to repair the barn roof, which needs it." Another silence. Outside, the afternoon wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like something breathing. "You looked at the barn roof," he said. "I look at everything," she said simply. It is a habit. She slid the pan of biscuits into the oven and turned to find Robert watching her with an expression that was no longer complicated. It had resolved into something singular and clear, and it was the kind of expression that made her very aware of the distance between them and of the fact that the kitchen was not a very large room. "Etta," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the title in front of it, and she felt the small shock of it like the first drop of rain before a storm, the way a single thing can announce everything that is coming. She met his eyes. "I find that I am very glad you came," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and allowed herself to feel the full weight of those words, and then she turned back to the stove and said, "The biscuits will be ready in 20 minutes." But she was smiling, and she did not try to hide it, and she was relatively certain from the sound of his chair being pushed back and his boots on the floor that he was smiling too, though he was gone from the kitchen before she could confirm it. Etta's second week at the Whitfield ranch brought with it a visitor who arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, which was to say the sort of visitor whose arrival was designed to be difficult to prepare for. His name was Franklin Whitfield, and he was Robert's younger brother by 3 years, and he arrived from Santa Fe in a well-appointed buggy with a matched pair of bays and clothes that said money with every seam. He was handsome in the easy, unearned way that Robert was not, with a salesman's smile that arrived before the rest of his face and stayed after the genuine warmth had departed, and he looked at Etta with the particular calculating appraisal of a man who immediately needed to know what category to put her in. Robert's face had done something complex when he saw the buggy coming up the road. It had not been the face of a man who was happy to see his brother. It had been the face of a man who had been hoping to have more time before this particular conversation. Etta understood why within the first 15 minutes of Franklin Whitfield's company. Franklin had, as near as she could determine from the careful way he spoke around the subject, been the original source of the information about Robert's ranch that had been passed to Mrs. Dunmore's introduction service. He had been the one who suggested the arrangement. He had been the one who had described to Mrs. Dunmore what the ranch required. And his description of what the ranch required had been, from what Etta could piece together, almost entirely focused on the domestic and social aspects of the role. Someone to manage the household, to be presentable, to represent the ranch well in the social landscape of the territory. In other words, it had been Franklin, not Robert, who had set the expectation that a companion was what was needed here. Robert, she was beginning to understand, had accepted his brother's characterization without fully questioning it, the way younger siblings sometimes accept the narrative frame their older siblings build around situations, particularly when they are tired and stretched thin and have a ranch to run. "I hear you have been proving yourself useful around the place," Franklin said over lunch, with a tone that managed to be both complimentary and slightly condescending, the tone of a man who considered himself the final arbiter of what was useful and what was not. "I have been trying to be helpful, yes," Etta said. "Robert tells me you fixed the well." Franklin cut his chicken with the deliberate precision of a man who took meals seriously. "Remarkable, though I do hope you are not wearing yourself out with that kind of thing. It is not exactly what we had in mind when we arranged for an introduction." Etta set her fork down. She was aware of Robert across the table going very still. "What did you have in mind?" she asked, keeping her voice entirely pleasant. Franklin smiled the arriving before the rest of his face smile. "Someone to make this place feel like a proper home. Robert has been out here alone for too long and the ranch shows it. What it needs is a woman's touch, not," he waved a hand vaguely, "mechanical expertise." "Interesting," Etta said. "Because from what I can see, what this ranch needs is what any working operation needs: good judgment, sound knowledge, and the willingness to put both in service of the work, which is what I have been doing." She picked up her fork again. "The well is running. The east fence line is repaired and will not collapse again in the next weather. The feed purchasing strategy for the coming season will save approximately $200 against last year's cost. The account books have been reviewed, and there are two specific adjustments to the sales arrangements that will meaningfully improve the operating margin. She looked at Franklin directly. Is that the kind of useful you meant, or were you thinking of something more decorative? The table was very quiet. Franklin looked at his brother. Robert was looking at Etta with that expression again, the one she had first seen at the well when the water started running, that recalibrating, reassessing, wide-awake look that she was beginning to associate specifically with him and with no one else. "You discussed the account books with her," Franklin said to Robert. "I gave her access to them," Robert said, "as I would give access to any person who was genuinely involved in the operation of this ranch. Robert, she has been here a week." 10 days, Robert said. "And in 10 days she has identified and resolved 3 problems that have been ongoing for months. If you have a criticism of that, I would be interested to hear it framed in a way that makes sense." Franklin was quiet for a moment. "I am just saying," he said, more carefully now, "that there are certain expectations around this arrangement. The territory's social landscape matters to how you are perceived, and how you are perceived matters to your business relationships. I want to make sure that what is being built here is appropriate." "Appropriate to whom?" Etta said. Franklin looked at her. The smile had departed entirely now, and what was underneath it was not hostile exactly, but was assessing in a way that had nothing warm in it. "To the position you are being considered for," he said, "which is a serious one, with serious implications for this family's standing." "Franklin," Robert said, and there was a quiet, final quality in the single word that Etta had not heard from him before, the tone of a man who is done allowing someone to speak in a way they have no right to. "Etta is my guest, and she will be treated accordingly. What she has done here in the past 10 days is more valuable than anything this ranch has received in the past year. If you have come to offer advice on this arrangement, I am telling you that the arrangement is going well and I do not need advice. If you have come to visit your brother, you are welcome to stay tonight, but you will treat her with respect." A long beat. "Of course," Franklin said pleasantly, the smile returning in a lighter, more careful version. "I meant no offense." He looked at Etta. "I meant no offense," he said again, directly to her this time, and this time it sounded closer to genuine. "None taken," Etta said, and let it rest there. After dinner, while Franklin sat on the porch with a cigarette and the long silence of a man reconsidering things, Etta and Robert washed the dishes side by side in the kitchen, which was a thing that had somehow become an established part of the evening routine without either of them explicitly deciding it would be. "I apologize for my brother," Robert said. "You do not need to apologize for him," Etta said. "He said what he believed and he was honest about it, and I would rather know what someone believes than have them keep it hidden. He had a specific idea of what this arrangement should look like," Robert said, "and you are not it." "No," Etta said, "I am not." "I am glad," Robert said, simply and without any of the careful qualification that the statement might have warranted from a man who was being more guarded, and the simplicity of it made Etta's hands go still in the dishwater for just a moment. "Robert," she said, "yes. Why did you agree to this introduction? The real reason, not the practical one." He was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with the methodical care he brought to everything. "Because I have been out here for 9 years, he said, "and I have built something real and I am proud of it, and I look out at it at the end of every day from the front porch and I feel, not lonely exactly, but aware of a distance. Between what this place is and what it could be, between what my life is and what it could be." He set the plate aside. "I have always believed that a life is meant to be shared with someone who is genuinely present in it, not a guest, not a companion, a person who is actually here." Etta thought about that for a moment. "I have been looking for that too," she said. "Not in the way Miriam imagined. She thought I was looking for rescue, for someone to take the practical burden off my hands. That was never what I wanted. I wanted a place where what I actually am is what is needed, where there is not a gap between the person I am and the role I am expected to fill." She looked up at him. "This place," she said carefully, "has felt, several times in the past 10 days, like a place where that gap might be small." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that saw things clearly and didn't look away from what they saw. "I would like it to be smaller still," he said. Franklin Whitfield left the next morning, and the ranch settled back into its rhythm. But it was a different rhythm now, slightly warmer, slightly less careful, like a door that has been opened by an inch and cannot quite be closed all the way back again. Over the following week, something between Etta and Robert shifted from the tentative and provisional into something that had begun to put down roots. They worked together every day, and the work was genuine and shared, and neither of them treated it as performance. She knew tools and systems and the mechanics of things. He knew land and cattle and the long-term relationship between a rancher and his territory. And where these two kinds of knowledge met, which was almost everywhere, what emerged was something more effective and more interesting than either of them would have arrived at alone. One afternoon they rode out to check on the cattle in the northern pasture, and a storm came up faster than either of them had anticipated, the kind of fast, fierce thunderstorm that the New Mexico high desert produced in summer with almost theatrical speed. Black clouds slamming over the mountains to the west, and the temperature dropping 10 degrees in 15 minutes. They found shelter in a small stone-lined shack that sat at the edge of the pasture, a structure that had been built sometime in the 1860s by a previous owner of the land, and was barely large enough for 2 people, and the saddles they pulled in out of the rain. The storm hammered the roof, and the lightning was very close, flashing through the single small window, and illuminating the interior in stark white for instants that were simultaneously less than a second, and somehow longer than that. Etta sat with her back against the stone wall, and Robert sat across from her with his knees drawn up, and they listened to the rain and the thunder, and the forced smallness of the space made the distance between them feel relevant in a way that it had not been quite so immediate before. "Tell me about your dark past," Etta said, into a gap between thunder rolls. He looked at her. "I have been waiting for you to ask something like that," he said. "You mentioned your father," she said. "The way you talked about him sounded like someone describing a battle they had survived." A beat of rain against the roof. "My father," Robert said, "was a man of the old Virginia school who believed that land was the measure of a man's worth, and that the worth of land was measured by what could be extracted from it. He extracted everything from everyone around him, from his workers, from his wife, from his sons. Franklin became his creature. That is why Franklin thinks the way he thinks, why he cares about appearance and position, and what the territory's social landscape will say about this family." He paused. "I was supposed to become his creature too. I chose not to." "How did you choose not to?" Etta asked. "I came here," Robert said. "I took the portion of the inheritance that was mine, and I came as far from Virginia as seemed reasonable, and I bought this land, and I told myself that I was going to build something that was the opposite of everything my father believed, something that worked because it was honest, not because it had extracted the work out of someone who had no choice." He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. "Domingo has been with me for 7 years, he said. "He is paid a fair wage and treated with respect, and has complete say over how his work is organized. The cattle are managed responsibly. I do not overstock the pasture. I do not push the land harder than it can bear. Everything here is done at a pace and in a way that can be sustained." He met her eyes. "My father would have considered that weakness. I consider it the only way to build something that lasts." Etta looked at him for a long moment, at the lightning coming through the window behind him, at the lines of his face in the stormlight. "Your father was wrong," she said simply. "Yes," Robert said. "He was. My father was sometimes wrong too," Etta said. "He was a good man, but he was not always a fair one to my mother. He expected her to be what the era expected her to be: quiet, accommodating, invisible in her own home. She was not built for that, and neither was I, and I think part of what he was doing when he taught me the business was correcting something in himself, trying to say that the next generation of women in this family would not be invisible." "Is that what brought you here?" Robert asked. The need to not be invisible. In part, Etta said. I had a life in St. Louis after we sold the business. I had a small house and friends and a degree of social respect, and it was a very good life in its way. But there is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being capable in a world that is constantly surprised by your capability, where every ordinary thing you do correctly is treated as exceptional, and every mistake is treated as evidence that you were never suited for the work in the first place. She looked at the rain streaming down the small window. I wanted to be somewhere where what I could do was simply what I could do, not a surprise, not a performance, just normal. It is normal here, he said quietly. What you can do is simply what you can do. She looked at him, and the storm was doing something violent and beautiful above the stone roof, and the space between them in that tiny shack was the smallest it had been, and Etta thought with the clear practical part of her mind that this was a moment that had a before and an after, and she was standing precisely in the hinge of it. "Robert," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the way his voice got when he was paying the most complete attention. "I would like to stay," she said. "Not as a temporary arrangement, as someone who is actually here." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I would like that too, very much." The storm moved east over the mountains, trailing its noise behind it, and left the air washed clean and brilliant, the way the desert always is after rain, every color sharpened to something that seems too vivid to be real. They rode back toward the ranch house in the early evening, and the conversation between them was easy and continuous. The conversation of two people who have stopped being careful with each other and have discovered that what is underneath the carefulness is better than anything that was on top of it. 3 days later, Domingo appeared at the ranch house door in the early morning with his hat in his hands and a face that said something had gone wrong during the night. The water trough in the cattle pen had collapsed, a structural failure in the old wooden base that had been weakening for months and had finally given way. And the cattle were without water again, and the nearest alternative source was nearly 2 miles of driving distance, which was not impossible but was time-consuming and would stress the animals in the July heat. Robert was already assessing the damage with Domingo when Etta arrived, and she could see from the way the base had buckled that the failure was in the corner joinery. The corner posts had rotted where they met the ground, and the whole structure had given way from there. "We can rebuild it," Robert said. "I have the lumber." "It will take 2 days at least," Domingo said. Etta was looking at the water barrel storage on the barn's eastern side, 4 large wooden barrels that were currently used for storing dry grain, each one approximately 40 gallons. She looked at them, then looked at the cattle pen, then looked at the distance and the angles, and then said, "If we empty those 4 grain barrels and roll them to the pen, we can use them as temporary troughs while we rebuild. They will need to be sealed on the inside, and we will need to run the hose from the well. Do you have enough hose?" Domingo looked at the barrels. "The barrels would need blocking so they do not roll. Wedge the outside of each one with rocks and drive 2 stakes on either side," Etta said. 15 minutes of work and they will not move. The grain can go in the feed sacks against the barn wall. There are empty ones folded on the second shelf." Robert was already walking toward the barrels. The temporary troughs were set up within the hour. The grain transferred and the barrels filled and the cattle watered. And then the 3 of them started on the permanent rebuild, working steadily through the day. And what Etta noticed was that at some point in the morning, she could not have said exactly when, the 3 of them had stopped working as employer and hired hand and guest, and had started working simply as 3 people who had a thing that needed doing. Domingo said, at the end of the day, in his careful, precise way, "You are good at seeing the solution that is already present. My father used to say that most solutions are already on the property," Etta said. "You just have to look at what you have instead of what you wish you had." Domingo considered this for a moment and then nodded, the same small, definitive nod she had seen from him at the fence line. "That is true," he said. "That is also true of people." He said it without inflection, and then he went to put the tools away, and Etta stood there for a moment with Robert beside her, and they both understood exactly what Domingo had meant, and neither of them said anything about it. But when Robert's shoulder brushed hers as he turned to follow Domingo, neither of them moved away from the brief warmth of the contact. That night after dinner, Robert went to the small parlor room off the main hall, the room that had a piano in it, an upright rosewood instrument that was entirely incongruous in a cattle ranch in the New Mexico desert and that had clearly been moved here at significant effort and expense at some point. And when Etta followed him there, he was standing beside it with his hand resting on the lid. "You play?" she asked. "No," he said. "My mother played. When I left Virginia, I could not take anything of hers. My father would not permit it. But when I came through Santa Fe in my first year here, I saw this in a shop and I bought it." He paused. "I could not have told you precisely why. I think I wanted something in this place that came from gentleness." Etta looked at the piano. She walked to it and sat down and lifted the lid and ran her fingers lightly across the keys. It was slightly out of tune in the higher register, but the lower octaves were still good, and she played a chord, and the sound of it in the ranch house room was startling and strange and right. "What did she play?" Etta asked. "Hymns mostly," Robert said. "She was a woman of profound faith, which was the only place my father could not entirely reach." He was quiet for a moment. "She also played one particular Scottish air. I have not thought of it in years, but I still know how it goes." "Hum it," Etta said. He looked at her. "Hum it," she said again, gently. He did slowly, a melody that was simple and old and had that particular quality of folk music that suggests it has been traveling through human mouths for so long that it has worn itself smooth. Etta listened carefully, found the key, and began to play it, hesitantly at first and then more surely. And when she got it right, she saw something happen in Robert Whitfield's face that she would not have been able to describe to anyone with complete accuracy. Some wall that had been built so long ago, it had become structural, so integrated into the architecture that he had likely stopped noticing it was a wall at all, and in that instant, with the old Scottish air moving through the lamplight of the ranch house parlor, it opened. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily. But he sat down in the chair beside the piano and he listened to her play his mother's song with his eyes closed and his hands resting open on his knees in the posture of a man who is receiving something. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Thank you," he said. "Thank your mother," Etta said. "She had good taste in music." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and whatever was in his face then was so unguarded that it felt like being trusted with something valuable and fragile, and Etta held it carefully. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "When you told me the other day in the storm that you wanted to stay, were you telling me that you wanted to stay in this place and work, or were you telling me something else?" Etta met his eyes. "I was telling you something else," she said, the quietest of silences. "I am glad," he said, for the second time, in the same simple tone he had used the first time, and it meant exactly the same thing as it had meant then but was larger now, larger in the way that declarations become when you have spent enough time next to a person to understand precisely what they are declaring. He reached across the space between the piano bench and the chair and took her hand, just that, her hand, resting in his, the calloused palm of a man who had been working this land for 9 years, and the slightly ink-stained fingers of a woman who had spent years managing accounts and learning the names of every fastener in a hardware catalog, and held it. It was the most thoroughly considered and completely voluntary touch she had ever received from anyone, and she thought that it was almost certainly a reflection of who he was, that even in this he would be unhurried and honest and absolutely certain of what he meant by it. "I should tell you," she said after a while, "that I intend to write to Miriam and tell her that her description was inaccurate and that she should revise how she thinks of me." "What will you tell her?" Robert asked. "I will tell her that I am a person who repairs things," Etta said, and that I have found a place that needs repairing and is worth it." He squeezed her hand once, and they sat there in the parlor with the lamp burning low and the desert silence outside and the piano waiting for its next song. And it was, Etta thought, one of the most complete moments she had ever occupied. The weeks that followed were the unfolding of something that both of them had decided to be serious about. And seriousness, in the currency of two people like Etta Sawyer and Robert Whitfield, looked like honesty and work, and the slow accumulation of ordinary days that added up to something extraordinary in their sum. Robert rode to Santa Fe in August to meet with Raymond Chastain of Cimarron at a trade meeting, taking with him the letter Etta had prepared laying out the terms of a direct sale arrangement, and came back 3 days later with a signed agreement and a price for the fall cattle sale that was significantly better than what the broker in Santa Fe had been delivering. He came through the door of the ranch house and found Etta at the kitchen table working through the updated accounts with the new figures, and he put the signed agreement down on the table beside her and said, "You were right about Chastain," and she looked at the price on the paper and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a calculation that had been proven out. "The bulk feed order," she said, already doing the arithmetic. "We can place it now, before the prices climb in September." "Already sent the wire from Santa Fe," he said. She looked up at him, and he was smiling, a real smile, not the controlled, careful expression he kept for ordinary social situations, but the one she had seen a handful of times now that was entirely unguarded, and that changed his whole face into something that she found it difficult to look at without wanting to keep looking. "You sent the wire before you came home," she said. "You had already thought of it," he said. "I simply executed the thought." She stood up from the table. She had been thinking, for about a week now, with a certain amount of deliberate care, about the question of what came next for the two of them. They had not spoken about it explicitly, but the arrangement with Mrs. Dunmore had a natural term. The evaluation period was typically 4 weeks, at the end of which both parties either agreed to proceed further or ended the introduction. They were in their 4th week. The question was implicit in every conversation they had, present in the way they were with each other now, which was no longer the careful distance of an arrangement but the easy, warm, inhabited proximity of two people who had decided something that had not yet been said aloud. "Robert," she said. "Yes," he said in that careful, attending voice. "I believe that Mrs. Dunmore's standard arrangement contemplates that at the end of 4 weeks the parties make a decision about proceeding." "It does," he said. "I would like to proceed," she said. "I would like to proceed in the most formal and conventional way available to us, which I believe involves a license from the county court and the presence of a minister, and I would like to do it before I change my mind about the conventional part, because I am not by nature a patient person when I have made up my mind about something." He looked at her for a moment. "You have made up your mind," he said. "I made up my mind somewhere between the well and the fence line," she said. "I have been waiting to say so, until I was certain you had made up yours." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he cupped her face in his hands with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, and he kissed her for the first time, with complete intention, in the kitchen of the ranch house with the account books on the table behind her and the afternoon light coming through the window and the sound of the well, now running free and clear, somewhere outside. And it was a kiss that said exactly what both of them had been not quite saying for 4 weeks, which was, here and real and certain. When they separated, she was smiling, and so was he, and she thought that his smile in this moment was the best thing she had seen in New Mexico, which was a territory that contained some genuinely spectacular things. "I will ride to Arroyo Seco tomorrow," he said, "and send a letter to the circuit minister. He comes through this area in September." "September," Etta said. "That is 5 weeks." "Is that too long?" he asked, and there was the smallest edge of amusement in his voice. "I can manage 5 weeks," she said with great dignity. "I have managed considerably longer periods of inconvenience." He laughed, a full, real laugh, the kind she had only heard from him a few times before, the kind that sounded like something had been given back to him, and she stored the sound of it in the precise, careful archive she kept of things she wanted to remember. She wrote to Miriam that same evening, a long letter that she composed with great care, beginning with the sentence, "Dear Miriam, I am writing to correct an impression and to share some news that I believe will make you both surprised and very happy. And I want you to know before I tell you anything else that your inaccurate description of my skills is among the best mistakes you have ever made." She told Miriam about the well and the fence line and the account books and Raymond Chastain and the bulk feed order, and about the parlor with the rosewood piano and the old Scottish air, and the hand that had been offered and accepted across the small distance between a piano bench and a chair. She told her about the man himself, the quality of his attention and the honesty of his character, and the 9 years of patient work he had put into building something that was the opposite of his father's world, and about the way his smile changed his face into something entirely different from his ordinary face. She sent the letter with the supply rider who went through Arroyo Seco on Thursdays, and then she set down her pen and looked out the window at the ranch in the evening light. The well, the barn, the fence lines running out toward the arroyos, the cattle moving slowly in the northern pasture, the whole working, breathing, living organism of the place that had, over these 4 weeks, become hers in a way she had not anticipated when she climbed off that buckboard. She looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at things, carefully, completely, with an eye for what was broken and what was strong and what, given the right attention, could be made to last. What she saw was something strong. The circuit minister arrived on the 18th of September, 1883, a man named Reverend Aldrich who rode a mule with great personal dignity and performed marriages, baptisms, and funerals across a circuit of approximately 300 miles of New Mexico territory, with the efficient cheerfulness of a man who had reconciled himself entirely to the demands of his vocation. He was small and sunburned, and had kind eyes and a handshake like a blacksmith. The ceremony was held on the front porch of the ranch house in the morning, before the heat came up fully, with Domingo Reyes as witness and the neighbor from the adjacent property, a widow named Mrs. Palacios, who had ridden over the previous evening when she heard there was to be a wedding, and had contributed to the occasion a cake made with dried apricots and mesquite honey that was, by unanimous agreement afterward, the finest cake that had been eaten anywhere in that part of New Mexico in living memory. Etta wore the blue dress she had brought from St. Louis, the good one that she had packed thinking she might need it for formal occasions, and that had spent the first 4 weeks of her time at the ranch folded carefully in her trunk while she wore practical cotton and kept her sleeves rolled up. She put her hair up and wore the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and when she came out of the house onto the porch where Robert was waiting, his expression did the thing she had seen it do in the storm-lit line shack and in the parlor and in the kitchen, that full, unguarded opening, and she walked toward him without looking away. Reverend Aldrich performed the ceremony with the serious warmth he likely brought to all of them, and the vows were the traditional ones of the era, and when they got to the part about honoring and cherishing, Robert said the words looking directly at her with the quality of attention that she had learned was his most essential feature, complete and honest and utterly present, and she said them back with the same quality. Domingo shook Robert's hand after and nodded to Etta with a formal respect that contained, she thought, the beginning of genuine warmth. Mrs. Palacios embraced her with the uncomplicated generosity of a woman who believed in marriages and was glad to see one done correctly. Reverend Aldrich ate 2 pieces of the apricot cake, declared himself the beneficiary of the finest perquisite of his profession, climbed back on his mule, and continued east on his circuit. That evening, after the guests had gone and the porch was quiet, and the stars were doing what stars did in the New Mexico desert, appearing in such quantity and proximity that the sky became less like a backdrop and more like a ceiling, Robert and Etta sat on the porch steps with cups of coffee and watched the darkness settle over the land they now shared equally. And the comfortable silence between them was the best kind of silence, the silence that does not need to be filled. "I want to tell you something," Robert said. "Tell me," she said. "When Mrs. Dunmore's letter first arrived, the one describing you, I almost did not pursue the introduction." He looked out at the dark desert. "Franklin had convinced me that what this place needed was someone to make it more presentable, more socially viable. And when I read the description, the music and the literature and the social graces, I thought, that is a woman who will be uncomfortable here and will leave within a month. I nearly wrote back to say no." "What made you write to say yes instead?" Etta asked. "The last line of Mrs. Dunmore's letter," he said. "She wrote that you had read the description of the ranch and said that it sounded like a place where the work was honest. She said you sounded like someone for whom honest work was a recommendation, not a deterrent." He paused. "I thought that was worth finding out about." Etta smiled at the dark desert. "Mrs. Dunmore was very perceptive," she said. "Mrs. Dunmore," Robert said, "should be running a country." They sat there on the steps until the coffee was gone and the night had fully arrived, and then they went inside into their home, into the life they had both arrived at by different roads and were now going to build together from this particular piece of New Mexico ground outward. The fall was a season of harvest and settlement, in the literal and the figurative senses both. The cattle sale in October, conducted through Raymond Chastain in Cimarron as planned, came in 12% above the previous year's best result, and confirmed every calculation Etta had made from the account books. Robert rode back from that sale with the look of a man whose confidence in his own judgment had been renewed, not because the money was the point, but because it was evidence that the way he had chosen to run this place, the honest and careful and sustainable way, produced results when aligned with the right knowledge and the right partnership. The bulk feed order arrived in October and was stored in the barn in the new organized system, and the savings against the previous year's feed cost would, as calculated, fund the repair of the barn roof before winter arrived. Domingo managed the roof repair with 2 hired men from Arroyo Seco over the course of a week in late October, while Etta sourced the roofing materials from a supplier in Santa Fe that she had found through an old contact from her father's hardware business days, at a cost that was 20% below what the local supplier would have charged. Domingo observed, after the roof was finished and the rain that came in November stayed outside where it belonged, that having Mrs. Whitfield on the property had added the equivalent of another full-time worker's worth of knowledge and problem-solving to the operation, which was, coming from Domingo, roughly equivalent to a public declaration of deep admiration. In November, a letter arrived from Miriam. Miriam's letter was 5 pages long and contained, in approximately equal measure, joy and guilt, and the particular breathless energy of a woman who has discovered that something she did accidentally produced the best possible outcome, and is trying to simultaneously claim credit and apologize for the near disaster. She wrote that she was overjoyed. She wrote that she was mortified about the description. She wrote that she had always known. She wrote in her heart that Etta was exceptional in every way, and she could not imagine why she had described her so inadequately, except that she had simply never seen that side of Etta and had not known to ask. She also wrote that she was coming to visit in the spring, if Etta and Robert would have her, because she absolutely had to see this ranch and this man who had apparently been exactly what she had always wanted for Etta even before she understood what that was. Etta wrote back a letter that was 2 pages and contained, "Of course you must come. The guest room will be ready, and I am not even slightly angry at you, because you were wrong in the right direction and I love you, and that is the whole of it." Christmas came to the Whitfield Ranch with the particular quality of a first Christmas in a place. The newness of every tradition they established that day had the weight of something that would be repeated, the weight of beginnings. They cut a small juniper from the arroyo and stood it in the parlor, and Etta decorated it with strips of colored paper and some brass fittings from the spare hardware box that she thought were festive enough. And Robert looked at the juniper with its brass decorations and said it was the most original Christmas tree he had ever seen. And she said that was because no one had ever had access to a well-stocked hardware box when decorating before. She played the piano that evening, Christmas hymns and one Scottish air that had become, by now, the music of the household. And outside, the snow that had been threatening for a week finally arrived, soft and steady, and covered the desert in something that made it look briefly like a different world. A world that had been waiting all year for this particular transformation. In January, Etta realized, with the deliberate precision of a woman who paid close attention to everything, that their family was going to grow. She told Robert on a morning in early February, at the kitchen table over coffee, directly and without preamble, because that was how she operated and he knew it and loved it. He set down his cup. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment, and she watched him receive the news, watched it move through him like water finding its level, watched the careful, controlled expression he wore for the world become something entirely different, something that was purely and completely joyful in a way that had no qualification in it. "Etta," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you certain?" "I am always certain before I tell anyone anything," she said. He came around the table, and he took her hands and he stood there holding them. And she looked up at him standing in the kitchen light of their ranch house in January 1884, in the life they had made from a broken well and a misguided letter, and the particular luck of two people who turned out to be exactly what the other one needed. And she felt something that she did not have a precise engineering term for, but that she thought her father would have recognized. Because it was the feeling of a thing working exactly as it was designed to work, nothing broken, nothing leaking, everything flowing as it should. "I love you," Robert said, which was something he said with the same quality he brought to every important thing he said, slowly and with full understanding of the weight of the words. "I know," she said. "I love you too, I have for some time." "How long?" he asked. "Since the well," she said. He laughed. "Since the well," he repeated. "You heard the water running and you went completely still," she said. "You heard what you had been missing for 3 weeks and you went so still you could have been part of the landscape. And I watched your face and I thought, that man knows what it is to be grateful for something real. That was when I knew." He held her hands for a long moment and then said, "I need to write to Franklin." "You do not need to write to Franklin immediately," she said. "I want to," he said. "I want to tell him that the arrangement he set in motion produced something he did not intend and could not have predicted, and that I am grateful for the accident even if he was wrong about everything he thought he understood about what I needed." "Tell him also," Etta said, "that the ranch is doing better financially than it has in 4 years because he will appreciate that part." "He will," Robert agreed, "and then he will feel conflicted about it, which I consider appropriate." She laughed, and he leaned down and kissed her forehead, and it was the most domestic and ordinary moment she could imagine, and she thought that was precisely the point, that this was what she had come here looking for, this ordinary, extraordinary rightness. Miriam arrived in April as promised, stepping off the buckboard in front of the ranch house in a traveling dress that was considerably more elaborate than anything that had ever been worn in that particular part of New Mexico. And she stopped and looked at Etta, who came out to meet her in her work clothes with her hair pinned up and her hands ink-stained from the morning's accounts, and Miriam burst into tears. "You look wonderful," Miriam said through the tears. "You look entirely like yourself. You look like you have always looked in your own head." Etta hugged her cousin with one arm and patted her back and said, "Don't cry on the buckboard driver, he looks alarmed." And Miriam laughed through the crying in the way she always had since they were girls. Robert shook Miriam's hand and was everything a brother-in-law should be, warm and direct, and immediately showing her the ranch, with the proprietary pride of a man who has built something worth showing. Miriam, who had come expecting to like him, and who was discovering that liking him was easier and more complete than she had anticipated, asked intelligent questions about the cattle operation and the land and the water situation, and Robert answered them with genuine pleasure in her interest. Domingo, introduced formally, bowed slightly and said, "Mrs. Sawyer Whitfield's cousin. We are glad to have more of the Sawyer family here," which was a speech of a length and warmth that was exceptional for Domingo, and which Miriam immediately and correctly interpreted as high praise. They sat on the porch in the April evenings and talked, the three of them, with the desert warming up around them and the cattle moving in the distance, and the well functioning perfectly with its new coupling, arrived from Santa Fe in January, installed by Etta in 20 minutes flat, while Robert watched with the expression he had standardized for watching her work, which was something between admiration and a kind of helpless fondness. Miriam stayed for 2 weeks, and what she took back with her to Kansas City was, as she wrote in her first letter after returning home, the absolute conviction that Etta Sawyer, Etta Whitfield now, was precisely where she was supposed to be, doing precisely the work she was made for, with precisely the person who understood the full value of what she was. She also took back, as she noted in a postscript, a small collection of brass hardware fittings that Etta had given her as decorative pieces for her own parlor, with the instruction that if Miriam ever mentioned again that Etta had no practical skills, she should look at the fittings and remember that they had previously been attached to a well that actually worked. The boy was born in September 1884, on a Tuesday, which meant he arrived with the same quiet efficiency and complete disregard for anyone's schedule that would characterize him throughout his life. Robert named him Jonathan without hesitation, because Etta had mentioned her father's name only 3 or 4 times across the course of the year, but he had listened, and he remembered everything she had ever told him, and he understood what that name meant. Jonathan Whitfield arrived in the world apparently entirely prepared for it, with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's particular expression of focused assessment. And when Etta held him for the first time in the early morning of that Tuesday, she thought of her father in his hardware store back room, and of the tool roll she had carried 900 miles on a train, and of the sound of water running free in the throat of a well. And she felt the full circle of it close around her, like something that had always been meant to complete itself. Robert sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son and his wife with an expression that she had never seen on any human face before, not because the emotion it expressed was rare, but because the particular quality of it was his, entirely his, built from everything he was, from the Virginia escape and the 9 years alone and the Scottish air on a parlor piano, and the morning he walked away from the well with a piece of corroded iron coupling held up in his wife's hand and understood, for the first time, that something was going to change. "Jonathan," he said softly, testing the name. "He has your eyes," Etta said. "He has your expression," Robert said. "He is already evaluating the structural integrity of this room." She laughed, quietly, so as not to startle the baby, and Robert put his arm around her, and they sat there together in the early morning light of the ranch house bedroom with their son and their life, and all the ordinary remarkable machinery of everything that worked. Domingo had placed fresh flowers from the garden outside the window, a garden Etta had started in the spring, because the soil on the south side of the house was good for it, and she liked growing things, and which had become, over the summer, one of the unexpected vivid surprises of the ranch, color in all that beautiful severe tan and green. The ranch continued to grow and to thrive. The fall sale in 1884 was better than the one in 1883. The spring of 1885 brought a decision to expand the cattle operation by 20 head, a decision made jointly over the account books on a Sunday morning, and confirmed with a handshake between Robert and Domingo, who was given a full partnership stake in the cattle operation in recognition of 7 years of essential work. A decision Etta had raised, and Robert had acted on with the decisive speed of someone who had been waiting for the right frame for something he had already known was right. Domingo, upon receiving the formal document of his stake, looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Etta and Robert and said, "This is a fair and honest thing." And Etta thought that from Domingo, who measured everything against those exact two standards, there was no higher commendation. Franklin Whitfield visited again in the spring of 1885, and he was different from the first visit in ways that were subtle but real. He held Jonathan with the unpracticed care of a man who did not have children of his own and was discovering, late in the game, that he wanted them. He walked the property with Robert and Etta and listened to the accounting of the year with genuine attention, and when Etta explained the arrangement with Chastain and the bulk feed strategy, he asked specific questions and took notes in a small leather journal he carried, and when he left he shook Etta's hand and said, "I owe you an apology. I had a very specific and very limited idea of what Robert needed, and I was wrong about it in almost every particular." "You were not entirely wrong," Etta said. "The ranch did need someone who could make it feel like a home. It just turned out that person also needed to be able to fix a well." Franklin smiled, and this time the smile arrived and stayed and was, she thought, the beginning of something genuine. The years built themselves out of days and seasons, and each year the ranch was stronger and the land was healthier, and the life they were making was richer. Not in the way that Franklin Whitfield's world measured richness, not in appearance and social position, but in the deep foundational way that her father's kind of richness was measured, in things that worked and people who knew why they worked and relationships that were honest and mutual and built to last. Jonathan grew into a boy who followed Domingo around the ranch with the same absorbed seriousness his mother had brought to her father's hardware back room, learning the names of plants and the behavior of cattle and the best way to read weather in the mountains to the west. He had Etta's precise, measuring intelligence and Robert's complete attentiveness, and the combination produced a child who was thoughtful in ways that surprised adults who had not expected it from a 6-year-old. A second child arrived in 1887, a daughter they named Clara after Mrs. Dunmore of the introduction service, who had sent a lovely wedding gift and a letter that said, simply and with great dignity, that she believed she had done her finest work in this particular match, and that she expected to be remembered gratefully. Clara had Robert's coloring and her mother's independence of spirit, and from her very earliest age expressed opinions about the arrangement of her physical environment that were both extremely specific and completely inflexible. Robert said that it was like living with a small, opinionated architect. Etta said that was exactly right, and she couldn't be prouder. The well, with its new coupling, ran clear and steady through drought and storm, and every season the desert could produce, because Etta had packed the temporary seal with a care and precision that had held long past the point anyone would have predicted. And when the new coupling arrived and was installed, she had done that job too, cleanly and correctly, and the well had asked no further attention from anyone since. It was, Robert said one evening when they were sitting on the porch in the late light of a summer that had been generous and golden, the best fixed well in 3 territories. "Do not tell Domingo," Etta said. "He will feel obligated to find something else that needs fixing just to restore balance. Domingo is currently rebuilding the tool storage system in the barn," Robert said. "He reorganized it approximately 3 months ago and it was already perfect, but I think he is making improvements to perfection for something to do. He learned from the best," Etta said. Robert looked at her sidelong, and she looked back at him, and 28 days of acquaintance had become 4 years of marriage and 2 children and a working partnership, and a love that had been built the way her father had taught her everything should be built on honest foundations, with proper tools, with an understanding of what you were working with and a respect for its particular strengths. The desert spread out before them in the evening gold, and the cattle moved in the north pasture, and the well ran below the hillside, and the juniper she had planted in the yard the previous spring was beginning to establish itself properly. And somewhere inside the house, Jonathan was explaining something to Clara in the serious, instructive tone of a 7-year-old who has decided his 3-year-old sister needs to understand how things work. "I have been thinking," Etta said. "Tell me," Robert said. "The Palacios property to the south," she said. "Mrs. Palacios has been talking about her nephew in Albuquerque for 2 years. I think she is considering whether he would take on the land. If he does not want it, it will likely be sold to one of the large operators from Texas who will overstock it and ruin the grazing within 5 years." Robert was quiet for a moment, listening the way he always listened. "The South Pasture water situation," he said. "The arroyo that runs between the properties. If we controlled both sides of it," Etta said, "we could manage it properly instead of dealing with whatever the next owner does to the upstream flow." "And the grazing land itself," Robert said. "It is good land," Etta said. "Rested because Mrs. Palacios has been running it lightly for years. It would triple the sustainable herd size if managed correctly." He turned his head and looked at her profile in the evening light, and she felt the look the way she felt most things from him, completely and without any armor against it. "Should I speak to Mrs. Palacios?" he asked. "I already did," Etta said. "Last Tuesday when I brought her the preserves. She would prefer to sell to us rather than to a stranger, and her price is fair. I wrote the numbers in the account book this morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Of course you did," he said, and there was such warmth in the words, such complete and specific appreciation, that she felt it all the way to her chest. "You are not annoyed that I moved ahead of the conversation?" she asked. "I am never annoyed when you move ahead of the conversation," he said. "I have learned by now that by the time you tell me about something, you have already thought it through further than I would have in twice the time. It would be foolish to interpret that as running ahead of me. You are simply moving at your natural speed." She looked at him. "Robert Whitfield," she said. "Yes, I fixed your well." He smiled, that full, unguarded smile that had taken weeks to earn the first time, and that lived now at the surface of his face, available and unhidden. The smile of a man who had dismantled the wall because what was on the other side of it was worth more than the protection it had provided. "You did," he said, "before you finished doubting me. Considerably before," he said, "though in my defense I finished doubting you relatively quickly once I heard the water." "You did," she agreed. "That is one of the things I love about you. You correct yourself fast." He took her hand, as he had taken it that first night in the parlor, the same deliberate, unhurried, completely voluntary gesture, and held it as the evening light turned everything gold and then amber, and then the particular deep rose that preceded the desert dark, and the coyotes began their conversation in the arroyos. And inside the house Jonathan said something that made Clara laugh, and the well ran below the hill, clear and steady and endlessly patient. The way a fixed thing runs when it has been understood and tended by someone who knew what they were doing. The stars came out one by one over the desert, then in groups, then all at once, the way they always did out here, that dramatic revelation of the full night sky that Robert had described to her once as the desert's way of showing off. She had been watching it happen for 4 years now, and it still caught her breath every time. "Should I answer Mrs. Palacios tomorrow?" Etta asked. "Yes," Robert said. "Tell her we would be glad to take the land and that we will take proper care of it." "I told her that already," Etta said. "I told her we would take proper care of anything that came into our hands. It is a principle." He squeezed her hand. The night settled over the Whitfield ranch, over the well and the barn and the garden and the 2 properties that would, by the following spring, be one, over the 4 people asleep and awake within its boundaries, over the life that had been made here from honest work and honest attention and the kind of love that does not ask you to be smaller than you are, and it was good, and it was real, and it was built to last. Etta Sawyer had come 900 miles looking for a place where the gap between who she was and who she was allowed to be was small. She had found a place where it did not exist at all. She had also fixed a well. Both of these things, she thought, as Robert pulled her gently closer on the porch steps and the stars threw their light across the whole wide dark desert, were of roughly equal importance, and she was proud of both, and she would not have traded either one for anything the world had previously offered her. The well ran all night, as it would run every night, as it had run since the afternoon she fit her hands around a corroded coupling and turned it counterclockwise, quarter turn, and felt it give the moment that everything had hinged on, the moment before the water and after the doubt, the moment that held in its small practical hinge the whole of everything that had come after. Water, she thought, finds its way. So it turned out did everything else that was truly meant to flow.